Hello, I'm International Grandmaster Ben Finegold. Welcome to Volume 3 of our series, Chess Tactics for Scholastic Players. In this volume of our series, we will concentrate on two types of endgames. The first type of endgame is pawnless. There are no pawns on the board, specifically king and queen versus king, and king and rook versus king. The second part will feature king and pawn endgames and king and rook and pawn endgames. Please watch this video carefully. Often you will have to watch the segments more than once to understand fully how to deliver checkmate, get opposition, pawn promotion, and other key concepts to winning chess endgames. The first position will focus on king and queen versus king. This position or type of position occurs often in scholastic events. Often, children who are playing with the queen do not know how to deliver checkmate, and the game ends up being a tie as endless checks will ensue. However, let's find out how to actually win this endgame so we can win when we have the extra queen. You will notice there are 64 squares on the board, and the only way to deliver checkmate on one of these squares is to put the black king on one of the side rows, either this side, or one of the two back rows. Since there are no pawns on the board, each row is considered a back row if it's on the edge of the board. In this position, where it looks like black's king is nowhere near the side of the board or the edge, we actually can checkmate in 5 moves. The way to deliver checkmate in such positions is to make sure you use both of your pieces. We have 2 against 1. Often, a mistake children make in these positions is only giving check with their queen and never actually moving their king. Now, how do we deliver checkmate? Well, we force the black king to one of the side, back, or high rows on the chessboard so the king is trapped. The first move to make is to put the queen in the center of the board, queen to d5. Now, the black king has very few squares, very few options. It can't go to any of these squares. The queen and the king control these. In fact, this is the only legal move, king to f4, moving towards this side row. We've already moved our queen, and it's excellently placed in the center. So now we move our king, king to f2, getting our king next to the opposing king. Again, black has one legal move, king to g4. In this position, black wants to move away from the edge, this way. So white puts his queen on another center square, queen to e5, preventing king to f4. Black only has 2 legal moves, king h3 and king h4. King h3 allows checkmate in 1 move, either by queen g3 check or queen h5 check. So the best move that black can play is king h4. Now we move our king yet again closer to the black king, king to f3. Black again has 1 legal move, king to h3. And now, surprisingly, white has 3 different moves that are checkmate. White can play the relatively obvious queen g3 checkmate, also queen h5 checkmate. This is actually going to be our standard checkmate in this video. When the king is on the side row or one of the back rows, that means it can't go one of the directions. It can't go this way. When the kings are on the same line, we call that opposing kings. When they're opposing each other, you want to put your queen on the side of the king because the king cannot move in that direction. The queen controls all the squares that go up and down. The king controls all the squares that go towards the king, and there's no more room on the chessboard. So this checkmate will be our standard checkmate. This checkmate is also rather standard with king and queen versus king. And we have sort of an unusual checkmate. The queen can go all the way down the board to h8, giving checkmate from the side, but very far away. Okay, let's go back to the starting position and see how many moves that was. White put the queen in the center, queen to d5. That's move 1. King to f2 was move 2. Queen to e5 was move 3. King to f3 was move 4. And now one of the 3 checkmates. Did you notice something interesting? White never gave check to the black king. Every move that white made was cornering the black king until it had nowhere to go, and then white delivered checkmate. This is somewhat unusual. Generally in scholastic tournaments, when I see a position with king and queen versus king, almost every move the players make is with check. This is actually usually not correct. You want to force the king to one of the sides of the board or the back row. You don't want to check him every move, then the game would never end. In this way, we can deliver checkmate by having 2 pieces against 1. Now, you may know how to checkmate with a queen. Now you know how to mate with a king and a queen versus a king. You have two things you want to do. First, you want to move both of your pieces, your king and your queen, so you have 2 against 1. When you gang up 2 against 1, you have good chances to push your opponent around. The second thing you want to do is force the opposing king to one of the 4 back rows. There's the normal back row, your back row, plus the 2 side rows become back rows because there's no pawns on the board. Once your opponent's king is on the back row, your king and queen can force checkmate. Checkmating with the queen was not very difficult. Now we're going to get into something that's a little more complicated. It's checkmating with a rook. We have king and rook versus king. Here, we've started in a relatively simple position. The black king is already on the back row. In this position, we want to ensure the king does not leave the back row. In this position, the white rook is protecting g7. However, no white piece is controlling the 2 squares in front of the black king. If it was black's turn to move, black would certainly move his king to e7 or to f7. So what white has to do is ensure that black's king stays on the back row. In this position, white can play king to e6. And now, black only has one legal move in this position, and that move stays on the back row. It's king to e8. Notice the king can't move to the g file due to the white rook on g1. After king to e8, white has just the position he wants. The kings are lined up, king e6 and king e8. We call that opposition. And now the white rook moves to the side of the black king, giving checkmate. So this was actually a checkmate in 2 moves. When we delivered checkmate with the queen, we had a couple of options. We could move the queen on the side of the king, or we could move the queen in front of the king. We don't have this option with a rook. When a rook is in front of the king, the black king can move sideways. So whenever you checkmate with a rook, and the kings are in opposition, your rook must be on the side of the king. Generally, in many positions, what we would like to do is keep our rook on the row that is adjacent to where the black king is. If the black king is on this row, for example, we would like our rook on this row, the row next to it. So if you were white in this position, you would move your rook to this square, h7. Now the black king cannot leave the back row, and white can simply march his king up and get a position eventually where the kings are lined up in a straight line, opposition, and we can deliver checkmate. When black's king starts in the middle of the board, this requires the use of both of white's pieces to force him to one of the 4 back rows and deliver checkmate. The main difference with the queen and the queen can deliver checkmate in front of the king. So if this was a queen, that would be checkmate. The rook cannot do that. It must be on the side. So we must deliver checkmate in this way. Often, we have 2-move checkmates by simply making the black king move in opposition to the white king. In this position, they're 1 square away from opposition. Therefore, if we make a waiting move, let's say we start with this position. In the position we just looked at, black played king e8, allowing checkmate. Let's say it was white's turn to move. White would make what's called a waiting move. He would wait, say rook to g2, not changing the position in the least bit. And now, black is still forced to oppose kings, king to e8, and we can deliver the same checkmate, rook to g8 mate. In a lot of scholastic events, I see some kids trying to force the issue, and they will oppose kings, and their opponent, of course, will move out of opposition, and this can repeat several times with no result. So we have to be a little trickier, and we have to make black oppose the kings by making a waiting move. If you can make waiting moves with king and rook versus king, often your opponent will be forced into opposition, and you will have easy checkmate. In that example, we saw how a king and a rook can checkmate the opposing king, not quite as simply as a king and a queen, but it's still possible. What do you have to remember to do? Well, you have to get your opponent's king to one of the 4 back rows. You have to get your king to oppose the opposing king, and get your rook on the side to deliver checkmate. Unlike with the queen, your rook cannot go in front of the king. You must go to the side. You must force the king to the back row. And when you deliver checkmate, the game will end, and you should be very proud of yourself. Many people cannot checkmate with a rook, so this takes practice. If you practice, you'll be able to deliver checkmate, and you'll win many more chess games. Now that we've looked at our positions that have no pawns, let's look at positions that have 1 pawn. Our first example will be king and pawn versus king. This is a very standard position, and This is actually the most critical position you can reach when it has king and pawn versus king. It's a position where black has three choices, d8, e8, or f8. This position is actually the same regardless of where the king and pawn are. We could move it over one file. That would be fine. Either way is good. And the positions all have the same result. In this position, it's black to move, and he has a choice of three squares. Turns out one of those moves is reasonable, and black can draw the game. The other two moves, however, do not work out, and black would lose. Let's have a look. Let's say black makes one of the unfortunate moves, king to e8. Now, white gets the opposition, which we saw in the pawnless endgames as well. King to e6. The kings are lined up. Black must stay in front of the white pawn, otherwise the pawn will promote to a queen, and white can win. King to d8. White plays pawn to d7. And unfortunately, it's black's move here. Black has to play king to c7. King to c8 and king to e8 are illegal because the pawn can capture. Now white plays king to e7, makes a queen the next move, and as we learned in our first example, a king and a queen can deliver checkmate to a king, and white should win. However, black doesn't have to play king to e8. He can play the better king to d8. This is the correct move. This maintains the opposition for black, and black is ready for either choice, king c6 or king e6. Let's look at king e6. White moves his king forward, tries to promote his pawn. Black now gets the opposition with king to e8, keeping the kings opposed. White has no better way to try to win than to promote his pawn. Pawn to d7 check. Now black must block the pawn, king to d8. And although we saw this position previously, the difference is it is now white's turn to move. White must play king to d6 to protect his pawn. Any other move by white would allow king takes d7 with king versus king. So king to d6, and this is the dreaded stalemate. In this position, black is not in check. It is black's turn to move, but he has no legal move. In this case, the game is a stalemate, and it's considered a tie. Nobody wins. This is a drawn game, and black should be quite pleased because black had only a king left, but he was able to draw the game. If we go back in this position, the king should always go straight back. Even if we start from some other vantage point, let's say on the f file, okay, we have the same type of position. Black must play king to f8. If possible, black will play king to f7, blocking the pawn. If white prevents this by moving his king forward, now we get opposition, and we get the same stalemate. f7 check, king f8, king to f6. So keeping the opposition and forcing the opponent to stalemate you, that will make you draw positions that otherwise would be lost. That was a very basic king and pawn versus king position, but it was also the most important. This was a crucial position in chess where each move black makes could change the result of the game. In this particular instance, black has a drawn position but must play accurately to force white to deliver stalemate. Stalemate is a tie game, and the game would be a draw. If black makes even one small mistake, he would lose the game, and white would win. When you have a drawn position in a king and pawn ending, it's very important to play accurately, make all the right moves, maintain opposition, and eventually you will either win the opponent's pawn or you will get stalemated. That was a rather simple example of opposition where black was able to hold a draw. Let's look at some more complicated examples. In this position, white's king is actually in front of the white pawn as opposed to on the side, and black's king is actually very far away from the white pawn. This is very difficult, but black can still draw the game. What black needs to do is get the opposition with king to e7. Now the kings are lined up, and black is ready to meet white's move with a similar move. If king to f5, black plays king to f7. If white plays king to d5, black plays king to d7. And he's always lined up, and white's king has no chance to go forward and win the game. Now, if black doesn't get the opposition with king to e7, the correct move, and plays king to f7, now white's king can go forward, and white has a winning position. Let's play it out and see what happens. Let's say king to e8, staying in front of the pawn. King to e6, getting the opposition. King goes to f8. King to d7. And now white's king escorts his pawn to promotion. White's next four moves will be e5, pawn to e6, e7, and e8 equals queen. And with king and queen versus king, we know how to win. It's very important to keep your opponent's king back so that he cannot win the game by escorting his pawn to the promised land and making a queen. King to e7, getting the opposition, is the only way to draw the game, and in this way, black ensures he will not lose and get checkmated by the white queen. Now that was an excellent example of opposition. In opposition, the black and white king are lined up in a straight line, and who has the opposition depends entirely on whose turn it is to move. If it's white's turn to move, then his opponent, black, has the opposition. If it's black's turn to move, then white has the opposition, and the pawn can become a queen. So if you're defending such an endgame, when you have the opposing kings, you want your opponent to be on move so you can follow his king around. In this way, you can draw the game. If it's your turn to move when the kings are opposing, then you'll have to move out of opposition, and you should lose the game. And so you have to set this up in advance and figure out beforehand whose turn it will be to move when the kings are lined up. Then you'll have the opposition, and you will be happy, because if you have the winning position with the extra pawn, you'll win. If you have the worst position without the pawn, you can still draw. In that last example, we saw another elementary example of opposition. Now we're going to get slightly more complicated. We're going to talk about distant opposition. It's very similar to the regular opposition, but the king is further away. Here's a good example. The black king is very far away from the white pawn, and any false move by black could lose the game. However, we can still draw by opposition. If you were black in this position, your goal would be to get your king very close to the white pawn on e6 or f6. Therefore, you would assume black's king should go forward very quickly and try to get to those squares. However, this doesn't work because white gets the opposition. If king to e7, white plays king to e5 and lines the kings up. If black plays king to f7, white plays king to f5, lining the kings up. Eventually, black will be forced to move to one side or backwards, and white's king goes forward, and he can win the game. Therefore, if we go back to our starting position, we'll see the only chance for black is to get the distant opposition. This is the regular opposition on f6. The distant opposition would be f8. King to f8, keeping the kings lined up at a distance. And now, black is ready for any white response. If white plays king to e5, black gets the opposition with king to e7. And if white plays king to f5, black plays king to f7, maintaining the opposition, and no matter what white does, black can follow. There's no way for white's king to go forward into the position, and black maintains a draw. So very complicated example, but the opposition is the normal way to draw the game when you have just the king. But the distant opposition, a move like king to f8, works just as well. If you understand distant opposition, you can draw positions that are otherwise losing. Now, that position was a little more complicated. We're going to look at something that's even trickier with the same ideas. So here, we have a king and a pawn, and black has a king and a pawn. So it should be a draw. The problem is, white's king is much better than black's king. White's king is ready to go eat up that pawn with king and pawn versus king. So black has to somehow lose his pawn with dignity, maintaining the opposition. This is not simple. In this position, if black plays some standard king f7, going towards the pawns, king to e5, king to e7, king takes pawn, king d7, after king e5, king e7, it looks like black has the opposition, but it's not true because white's pawn is further back. White plays the temporizing move e4. Now it's black's turn to move, and every move that he makes will give way to white's king. White's king will now go forward. So just playing normal chess, moving your king forward doesn't work. We have to understand opposition and distant opposition. Then we can draw the game. Now, as you noticed, no matter what black does, white is going to win this pawn. Therefore, black should give up his pawn immediately and force the white pawn forward. With the white pawn forward, he has no more temporizing moves. Pawn to d4, a very difficult move to play. But since you're going to lose your pawn anyway, this is the best way to lose it. White must take, he takes d4. If you remember the previous example, we talked about distant opposition. Black's king wants to go here for the regular opposition, and he could play king to f8 for the distant opposition. Now, black can actually draw the game. If white plays king to e5, king to e7 maintains opposition. If king to f5, king to f7 maintains opposition. The trickiest move white can play is king to e4. Now, black has 5 legal moves, but only one of them can draw the game. Do you see which one maintains distant opposition? Let's have a look. Well, you can't move away from the pawn. King to g8, king to g7. Then the pawn is too strong. If king to f7, white can get the opposition 2 ways, king f5 or king d5. King e7 is one of our typical mistakes, moving the king forward without a good plan. King to e5 then gets the opposition and wins. It turns out the only move to draw the game and maintain the opposition is king to e8. And we've looked at this position previously. No matter what move white makes with his king going forward, black can meet it getting the opposition. King to e5, king to e7, king to d5, king to d7. So let's go back to the starting position and have a look. It was just amazing. In this position, black was losing his pawn anyway, so he played d4, giving it away immediately, forcing white's pawn forward. He no longer has a temporizing move. King to f8, the distant opposition, king to e4, and king to e8. And now the game should end in a draw. White has no way to get his king in front of his pawn in a good way and escort his pawn to a queen. We can get to a stalemate position. Let's have a look. King e5, king e7, d5, king d7, d6, and now king going straight back as in our first example, king to d8, king to e6, opposition again, d7 check, king to d8, king to d6, and once again this is stalemate. It's black's turn to move, and he has no legal move, and he's not in check. This would be a tie game. If you could somehow draw that original position, soon you'll be a chess master, and you'll be able to master all the king and pawn endgames. Now that we've talked about the regular opposition, where the kings are opposing each other, we now saw a more complicated example of the distant opposition, which also has the kings lined up, but further away, thereby distant opposition. Generally, the regular opposition, the kings are on the same color. The distant opposition, this is also true, but 2 squares back. And so even though your king is very far away from your opponent's pawn, if you maintain the distant opposition, you can still draw the game. Now we're going to look at a sort of a new kind of twist in the examples we're showing, because both sides have a pawn, and both sides might be trying to win. Very interesting position. Here we have a symmetrical position, and whoever's turn it is to move has a big advantage. So here the pawns are blocking each other. The kings are on the sides of the pawns. We're trying to figure out, can I win that pawn? Can he win my pawn? And we're going to learn a very important term in this example, and that term is Zugzwang. Zugzwang is a German word, and it means that if it's your turn to move, you have no good move, and you have to make your position worse, and then you'll lose the game. So typical Zugzwang position would be this one. White plays king to d5, attacking the black pawn. Black plays king to f4, protecting his black pawn. And now, unfortunately, it's white's turn to move. And white doesn't want to move, therefore he's in Zugzwang. Wherever move the white king goes to, e6, d6, c6, or anywhere else, black will play king takes e4 and win the game. Occasionally, I have a student suggest king to d4 because they're forgetting which way the pawns go. This pawn's going down the board. Black goes down and white goes up. That would be an illegal move. The king could be captured. And in fact, this is a mutual Zugzwang position. Whoever's turn it is here loses the game. If it's white's turn, he'll lose his pawn. If it's black's turn, this is very similar. He'll lose his e5 pawn. So let's go back. White has to use some finesse to win this position. It turns out white can win. Instead of king d5, white has to be prepared for black's response. Black's response is going to be king to f4, protecting his pawn. So white plays king to d6. This is much better. And now black has only one move to protect his pawn, king to f4. Otherwise, king takes pawn will win the game for white. And now king to d5. And unfortunately for black, it's his turn to move. And black has a losing position. Whatever move black plays, let's say king to g5, for example, white plays king takes e5. The only way for black to draw these positions, as we learned previously, is to get the opposition. The only opposition move in this position is king to e7, which cannot be played. Since king to e7 is not legal, black has a losing position. Let's go back to the beginning. What should white do here? King to d6. He's prepared for black to protect his pawn with king to f4, and only then does he play king to d5. If you're ready for your opponent's responses, you can plan ahead and you can win king and pawn endings by winning your opponent's pawn and having the only pawn that can promote. When your pawn promotes to a queen, you'll know how to win and you'll win the game. Zugzwang was a new concept that we learned in this example. And in fact, white had to set up this Zugzwang. Zugzwang is when it's your turn to move, and every move you make will make your position somewhat worse. In this position, if white played inaccurately on move 1, black would force Zugzwang, and white would be the one losing. But since white was thinking ahead, he played a finesse, king to d6, forcing black to protect his pawn, and only then did he put black in Zugzwang with king to d5. Thinking ahead in chess, putting your opponent in Zugzwang, this leads to many victories in king and pawn endgames. And now we're going to use some of the ideas we learned and add them all into one position, this position. Here, white has a king and 2 pawns, and black has a king. This should be a relatively easy win. However, this one is somewhat difficult due to stalemate. Whenever you're playing chess with someone and they have only a king left on the board, you should expect to win. However, often in scholastic events, children forget about stalemate, and when they have a lot of extra material, they stalemate their opponent and the game is a tie and nobody wins. This is very common in this type of position. Here, black has only 2 moves. He has to play king h8, and on the next turn, king to g7. So black's moves are very easy to play. If black plays another move, white will promote to a queen and win the game very easily. So white knows what black is going to do. What is white going to do about this? Well, king to h8. Now if white plays one of the normal moves, king to f6 or king to h6, it's normal to move your king forward in a king and pawn endgame. Those moves result in stalemate, and the game would be a tie. So white has to find another way to win. It turns out, no matter how white goes forward with his king, h6, f6, f7, or f8, it's going to be stalemate, and white won't win the game. Therefore, what white wants to do is alleviate the stalemate, get rid of the stalemate so it's not there anymore. The only way to do this is to sacrifice one of our pawns, give one of our pawns away. It seems like a crazy idea, but it works out pretty well here. White plays king f5, and after king g7, white sacrifices his pawn, h8, and makes a queen, pawn promotion, check. Now, there's no more stalemate to the position, and after king takes h8, we can win the game because we can get the opposition and revert back to what we learned earlier. King to f6, king must go to g8, pawn to g7, king to h7, king to f7, with very quick checkmate. White will promote to a queen, and it'll be checkmate in just 2 or 3 more moves. So this is quite interesting. The only way to win this position for white is to alleviate stalemate by getting rid of this pawn. This pawn controls the g8 square, and we want black to be able to move his king to the g8 square, so we're able to promote our pawn to a queen. Now, we can win another way by playing king to h5, but this takes a lot longer. After king to g7, promote to a queen, king to h6. Once again, we'll make a queen, but black's king can run out over here, and we'll have to take several moves to checkmate him. By playing the king to f5 and later f6, the king is forced to the side of the board, and checkmate will come very quickly. White promotes to a queen, and white's queen is perfectly placed, and black's king is on the side of the board. Sometimes in chess, we have too much material, and we have to sacrifice some to alleviate stalemate, and then the win is quite simple. That position was interesting because at first look, white was just winning simply. 2 extra pawns, no compensation, and both pawns were about to queen. However, we saw one problem which occurs often in king and pawn endgames. When your opponent has only a king left, sometimes he can stalemate himself, and when the game ends in stalemate, it's a tie. So when you have the winning position and you know you should win the game because your opponent has nothing left, you have to double check every move you don't stalemate your opponent. In this example, almost every move white made was stalemate. Therefore, he sacrificed one of his pawns so that stalemate could no longer exist, and then he got a winning king and pawn endgame, promoted to a queen, and won simply. Alleviating the stalemate, getting rid of the stalemate by sacrificing a pawn was the key to victory. This position is a little bit different than previous examples. Here we have king and pawn versus king and pawn, very similar to another position we looked at, except this time black can draw by getting the opposition the proper way. This is actually not so simple. In this position, white's king is very far advanced, attacking the black pawn. In a similar position we looked at last time, black's king was on f4, and he was losing. It was his turn to move, and he had to lose his pawn. It was terrible. This position is slightly different. The black king is back and can get in front of the white pawn, and we have excellent drawing chances. However, we still have to get the opposition. To do this, we play king to f7. This is called the diagonal opposition, for obvious reasons. Now, when white plays king takes e5, we can get the regular opposition, king to e5, and we've already seen this kind of position. Black has the opposition and can draw the game. And so in this case, even though black is destined to lose his e5 pawn, he can still arrange his king in such a way to get the opposition so that when white takes the pawn, he can draw the game. If black played the more obvious king to e7, and white plays king takes e5, now the king has nowhere to go to maintain the opposition, and black's going to lose the game. These endings are often very tricky, and just one mistake can take a drawn position and lead to a lost position. When you have a king and pawn endgame, you must ensure you play accurately every move so that if you do have a drawn position like this one, you'll end up drawing and not making a silly mistake and losing the game. On the rare occasions where you have a worse position and your opponent has the king and pawn and you only have the king, you still have to know how to maintain a drawn position. In that example, even though black was losing his only remaining pawn, he still found a way to oppose kings, preventing white's king from going forward and maintaining the draw. Even if you're losing your last pawn, you have to keep focus and make sure you can draw the game. Drawing is always better than losing, and don't give up hope just because your last pawn is gone. Now we're going to get into a little more complicated position where both sides have many pawns. Okay, so we have 3 pawns on the queen side for white and 3 pawns for black. And they're all blocking each other, so you would expect this would probably be a draw. However, we're going to learn about a new term in this position, a new concept, and that concept is called breakthrough. And in previous examples, when white had an extra pawn and black didn't have any pawns and black was struggling to draw, white had what we call a passed pawn. A passed pawn is a pawn that has no other pawn in front of it, preventing it from becoming a queen. Here, in this position, we have no passed pawns. Every pawn that white has an opposing pawn in front of it, so there's no chance to get a queen. Well, we can do a breakthrough in this position and eliminate some of the black pawns in front of our pawns, and we can make a queen this way. However, it requires some sacrificing, so it's actually quite difficult. So let's have a look. In this position, if white plays, let's say c6, black will play b6, and if white plays a6, all the pawns are blocking each other with a relatively obvious draw. And if you take on b6, we take on b6, it's the same thing. So it's very hard to break through. In this particular position, however, with 3 against 3, we can break through by playing the proper first move, which is pawn to b6. This puts black in some bit of trouble. Black must capture this pawn. He cannot possibly allow white to capture one of his pawns and thereby make a queen. However, capturing either way will lose the game. If we capture with the c pawn, let's look at that first. Now, the c pawn, which was blocking our c pawn, is no longer there. We're almost ready to make a queen. However, this b7 pawn is still stopping our pawn from becoming a queen. If c6, black can simply capture. We must eliminate this pawn. The way to eliminate the b7 pawn is to attack it. a6, another pawn sacrifice. White's threatening a takes b7 with an obvious queen to come, so black must capture. And now after sacrificing 2 pawns, white plays c6, and there's no black pawn that can stop this pawn from making a queen. And as you learned previously in the video, a king and queen can relatively easily beat a king. And so, after b6, since c takes b6 doesn't work, let's try a takes b6. Now, slightly different way of winning. Now the a pawn has no pawns in front of it. However, the b7 pawn can still capture the a pawn, so we play c6. And now white's threatening to capture this pawn again, making a queen. Black must capture. And now there's no black pawns in front of the a5 pawn, and this pawn becomes a queen. And this is called breakthrough. We're sacrificing material, in this case pawns, so that we get a passed pawn that's very far advanced, which will promote to a queen. Often in the endgame, it's not the number of pawns you have, it's the number of passed pawns, and those passed pawns can later promote, and you'll win the game. Well, that king and pawn ending was very interesting because neither side had any passed pawns, and it looked like a certain draw. But we learned a new term, breakthrough. White created a passed pawn by eliminating the black pawns in its path at any cost. In these examples, white sacrificed 2 of his pawns, so his third remaining pawn would promote to a queen, and thereby he would win the game. Black had no defense to this, and white's breakthrough was forced. Sometimes in chess, it's not the amount of pawns, it's the amount of passed pawns, the amount of pawns you have that could potentially become queens. Promoting your pawn to a queen is the ultimate goal in any pawn endgame. Now, this example is actually quite fun because we're going to do some pawn promotion in this example. Here, we have a king and a pawn for white, and black has a king and a pawn. And so generally this would be a draw. However, both sides have passed pawns, and both sides can make queens. So this is quite interesting. Let's see what happens if white tries to make a queen right away. Pawn to a4. Okay. And now, if black tries to make a queen, white will queen first, and the queen will attack the king. However, black simply plays king to e4 and attempts to stop the white pawn. And luckily for black, his king is just in time. 6, king c6. 7, king b7, and the game should be a draw because black will win this pawn and white will win this pawn. So the brute force method of attempting to promote your pawn to a queen does not work immediately due to the fact that black can stop this. So white, thinking ahead, decides to prevent black from playing king to e4 and plays the winning move king to e5. It's a very nice move. Now, there's no way that black can stop this pawn. But black has a passed pawn of his own, so he plays h5. And in fact, black's pawn will promote first. a4, h4, a5, h3, a6, h2, a7. And now, if black promotes to a queen, white can promote to a queen with check, winning the black queen on h1. Okay, this is unfortunate for black. But this is actually a composed study. It's a difficult problem. Instead of promoting to a queen, allowing white to promote to a queen with check, winning our queen, we simply play king to g2. And now, when white promotes to a queen, black plays king to g1, and now black wants to promote to a queen and draw the game. Luckily for white, because of his great king position and black's terrible king position, we can give checkmate. Now imagine this promoted pawn is a queen. Queen to a1 check. Queen to b2 check. And now we can allow black to promote his pawn. King to f4. Black makes a queen. King to g3. And now both sides have a queen, but black's queen is cornered. Black's king is basically cornered, and white is threatening all kinds of different checkmates. In a tournament game, you would replace these pawns and make them queens. If you didn't have queens on the side of the board, you should find some. You shouldn't move pawns like queens. The directors of chess tournaments don't like that. But we can do it here. If you remember this is a queen, we're threatening checkmate, and checkmate, and checkmate, and checkmate. And there's no good move for black to prevent these checkmates. And white's queen actually beats black's queen due to the great king position of white. So if we go back to the starting position, we can see that white can promote first if he tries to push his pawn immediately, but black can stop the white pawn. Therefore, white has to take time out and play king to e5, stopping the black king. And now, when both sides promote their pawns, white is very fortunate that he's promoting with check, winning the black queen. This was very complicated analysis, but it showed us in some endgames, king and pawn endings in particular, both sides can promote their pawns to queens, and the game is still not over. We can go from one endgame, a king and pawn ending, to a king and queen endgame. If you can calculate long enough and think about the position, you can win the game by promoting your pawn first or by promoting your pawn with check and winning the opponent's queen. That example was more complicated than previous examples, but it encompassed all of the same ideas. The main idea for white was to queen or promote his passed pawn. If he immediately tried to promote, black's king could prevent the pawn from promoting and capture it. So white took time out to improve his king's position. This allowed black to promote his pawn first, but white would promote with check, winning the queen. Black therefore could not promote his pawn to a queen, and with an extra queen, white was able to win. That was a very complicated study, but it was important in showing passed pawns that become queens, especially with check, will win you the game. Those were some very interesting king and pawn endgames. Now we're going to have a look at two classic rook and pawn endgames. These are endgames every Scholastic player should know. The first one, the black king is on the back row, tied down by the white rook. This is very bad for black. And white's king and pawn are very far advanced. This is one of the better positions for white. Luckily, black still has chances to draw. And black can actually draw by using the analysis of a famous French player, André Duncan Philidor, who was playing chess in the 1700s. He was a very good chess analyst, and he claimed black could draw this position by playing properly. And it turns out today, we agree, and black can draw. In this position, black only has one good move that ensures the draw. He plays rook to b6. This prevents the white king from moving forward. In fact, this is a relatively easy way to draw. What we do is we leave our rook on the third row. This is black's first row, second row, third row. It would be white's sixth row. We leave our rook on the third row, and we prevent the white king from moving forward. If our rook did not go to the third row, white's king could move forward, and if we check from behind, he can hide this way. If we check from the side, he can block with his pawn, and now black is in serious danger. Therefore, black plays rook to b6 immediately, stopping the white king from moving forward, and black basically maintains this blockade by moving his rook back and forth along the third row. The only chance white has to break this blockade is to push his pawn to e6, and now he's shielding from the black rook, and his king can move forward trying to win. Once the pawn has moved to the sixth row, now the rook has lost its usefulness on the third rank and goes all the way down to the first row, or the eighth rank in black's case. And now we check from behind the white king, and the white king has no safe haven. If white's pawn were in this position, as the example when it started, if the rook checks from behind, we have a place to hide. With the rook staying on the third row, basically forcing white to push his pawn to the sixth rank, now when we check from behind, there is no safe place for the white king, and we just keep checking the white king as long as possible. The only way to escape the checks is to come back and attack the black rook. For example, check, check, king to c4, check, rook check, and now king to c2 or king to e2. And now we can go win the white pawn because the white king is nowhere near protecting it. And so this is a very easy draw. We play rook check, and we capture the pawn. It's very critical that you understand this position. It's called Philidor's position. Rook to b6, keeping the rook on the third rank, stopping the white king from moving forward. When white eventually plays e6 to give his king a safe square, now we go all the way back. We can check from behind, and there's no way for white to win. Philidor's position is a very important position for you to know. Remember, keep your rook on the third rank, and you shouldn't lose. That was one of the most famous positions in chess, Philidor's position. Black's king is tied down to the back row. He has one pawn less. His pieces are badly placed, but he can still maintain a draw by preventing the white king from going forward, maintaining this position, and as soon as white pushes his pawn to the sixth row, moving his rook all the way to the end and checking from behind, and white's king has no safe place to go to. This is an excellent example of defense, stopping your opponent from moving his pieces up the board, and only in this way can black maintain the draw and be happy with the result of the game. Philidor's position was an interesting example of how black can maintain a draw by keeping his king in front of the passed white pawn. In this example, white's king is in front of the passed pawn, and the black king is on the side. This means white has good winning chances, because the black king is not in front of the pawn. And the black king cannot go towards the white pawn due to the white rook cutting off the file. This cutting off of the file is a very important idea in rook and pawn endgames. stopping the black king from approaching. This is Lucena's position, which was discovered a very long time ago, and Lucena discovered that white could win against any defense. Now, black is putting up a good defense here. He put his king very close to the pawn, and he's putting his rook on the A line, making sure the white king can't move at all. Okay? And the way white wins this position is he builds a bridge. And let's look at what building a bridge is. First, white checks the black king further away. Black either moves his king further from the white pawn, or he gives white the c8 square, and white can play king c8 and promote to a queen next move. That would be an easy way to win. A better resistance would be king to e7. And now, black is ready for white's king exit. If king to c7, black simply checks with the rook, continues to check the white king. The only safe place for the white king is b8, and then the pawn can't promote. Well, white has to be ready for this by playing rook to d4. And now, black will make a waiting move. Black has no move to improve its position. Well, let's say rook to a2. Now white plays king to c7, preparing to promote his pawn. He gets checked every move. Rook check on b2. The king protects the pawn again. And now after rook check, we play king to b5. And now it's relatively obvious why we played rook to d4. When we get checked again, we can block this check with our rook. And now this pawn will promote next move, and white will have an extra queen. So what we're doing is, we have two reasons to put our rook on d4. We're keeping the black king away from the white pawn by cutting it off on the d line, and we're preparing to get checked by the black rook by blocking with our rook, and thereby we win the game. By stopping the black king from approaching, and by stopping the black rook from checking you, eventually your pawn will promote, and you'll win the game with your extra queen. Well, that was an architect's example of how to build a bridge, but we used it in chess. In this position, white's pawn was on the 7th rank, ready to queen, but black had good defense to prevent this. White had to use some tricks. He had to block the black rook, force the black king away by building a bridge, using his king and his rook, getting his king excavated from the b8 square. Eventually, the white b pawn was unassailable. He could make a queen, and he would win the game with his extra queen. White had to think this out well in advance of how to stop black from checking him. By thinking ahead, you too can win your chess games. Well, I hope you enjoyed Volume 3 of our series, Chess Tactics for Scholastic Players, the Endgame. We looked at many different kinds of endgames and learned many new concepts: passed pawns, opposition, Zugzwang, and stalemate. If you master these concepts, you will be a master of the endgame.